Section 7 of the Vedanta Sutras by Badarayana, with the commentary by Shankaracharya, Volume 1, translated by George Thibault. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Introduction, Part 7. Pada 2. This and the two remaining padas of the fourth Adhyaya describe the fate of the Vidvan after death. According to Shankara, we have to distinguish the Vidvan who possesses the highest knowledge, namely, that he is one with the highest Brahman, and the Vidvan who knows only the lower Brahman, and have to refer certain sutras to the former and others to the latter. According to Ramanuja, the Vidvan is one only. Adhikarana 1, 2, 3. On the death of the Vidvan, that is, of him who possesses the lower knowledge, according to Shankara, his senses are merged in the manas in the chief vital air, prana, the vital air in the individual soul, jiva, the soul in the subtle elements. According to Ramanuja, the combination, sampati, of the senses with the manas, etc., is a mere conjunction, samyoga, not emerging, laya. Adhikarana 4. The Vidvan, that is, according to Shankara, he who possesses the lower knowledge, and the Avidvan, that is, he who does not possess any knowledge of Brahman, pass through the same stages, that is, those described hitherto, up to the entrance of the soul, together with the subtle elements, and so on into the nadis. The Vidvan also remains connected with the subtle elements because he has not yet completely destroyed avidya, so that the immortality which Scripture ascribes to him, amritatvam hi vidvan abhyasnate, is only a relative one. Ramanuja quotes the following text regarding the immortality of the Vidvan, quote, Yada sarve pramukyante kama yesya hridistita ata martyos mrito bhavati atra brahma samasnute, end quote, and explains that the immortality which is here ascribed to the Vidvan as soon as he abandons all desires can only mean the destruction, mentioned in the preceding pada, of all the effects of good and evil works, while the, quote, reaching of Brahman, end quote, can only refer to the intuition of Brahman vouchsafed to the meditating devotee. Adhikarana 5 raises, according to Shankara, the question whether the subtle elements of which Scripture says that they are combined with the highest deity, Teja Pariyasam Devatayam, are completely merged in the latter or not. The answer is that a complete absorption of the elements takes place only when final emancipation is reached, that, on the other hand, as long as the samsara state lasts, the elements, although somehow combined with Brahman, remain distinct so as to be able to form new bodies for the soul. According to Ramanuja, the Sutras 8 through 11 do not constitute a new Adhikarana, but continue the discussion of the point mooted in 7. The immortality there spoken of does not imply the separation of the soul from the body, quote, because Scripture declares samsara, that is, embodiedness, up to the reaching of Brahman, end quote. Tasya tavad eva kiram yavana vimokshya atta sampatsye. That the soul, after having departed from the gross body, is not disconnected from the subtle elements, is also proved hereby, that the subtle body accompanies it, as is observed from authority. Hence the immortality referred to in the scriptural passage quoted is not affected by means of the total destruction of the body. Adhikarana 6 is of special importance. According to Shankara, the sutras now turn from the discussion of the departure of him who possesses the lower knowledge only to the consideration of what becomes of him who has reached the higher knowledge. So far it has been taught that in the case of relative immortality, ensuing on the aparavidya, the subtle elements, together with the senses and so on, depart from the body of the dying devotee. This implies at the same time that they do not depart from the body of the dying sage who knows himself to be one with Brahman. Against this latter implied doctrine, Sutra 12 is supposed to formulate an objection. Quote, if it be said that the departure of the pranas from the body of the dying sage is denied, namely in Brihandarayaka Upanishad 4.4.5, na tasya prana utkramanti, of him the pranas do not pass out, we reply that in that passage the genitive tasya has the sense of the ablative tasmat, so that the sense of the passage is, quote, from him, that is, from the jiva of the dying sage, the pranas do not depart, but remain with it, end quote. This objection Shankara supposes to be disposed of in Sutra 13. Quote, by some there is given a clear denial of the departure of the pranas in the case of the dying sage, end quote, namely in the passage Brihadaranyaka Upanishad 3.2.11, where Yajnavalkya instructs Artabhaga that when this man dies, the pranas do not depart from it, asmat, the context showing that asmat means from it, namely from the body, and not from him, namely the jiva. The same view is, moreover, confirmed by Smriti passages. According to Ramanuja, the three sutras forming Shankara's sixth Adhikarana do not constitute a new Adhikarana at all, and, moreover, have to be combined into two sutras. The topic continuing to be discussed is the Utkranti of the Vidvan. If, Sutra 12 says, the Utkranti of the pranas is not admitted, on the ground of the denial supposed to be contained in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad 4.4.5, the reply is that the sense of the tasya there is sarirat, so that the passage means from him, that is, the jiva, the pranas do not depart. For this is clearly shown by the reading of some, namely the Madhyandinas, who in their text of the passage do not read tasya but tasmat. With reference to the instruction given by Yajnavalkya to Artabhaga, it is to be remarked that nothing there shows the Ayam Purusha to be the sage who knows Brahman, and, finally, there are Smriti passages declaring that the sage also when dying departs from the body. Adhikarana 7 and 8 teach, according to Shankara, that, on the death of him who possesses the higher knowledge, his pranas, elements, etc. are merged in Brahman, so as to be no longer distinct from it in any way. According to Ramanuja, the two sutras continue the teaching about the pranas, bhutas, etc. of the Vidvan in general, and declare that they are finally merged in Brahman, not merely in the way of conjunction, samyoga, but completely. Adhikarana 9. Shankara here returns to the owner of the Apara Vidya, while Ramanuja continues the description of the Utkranti of his Vidvan. The jiva of the dying man passes into the heart, and thence departs out of the body by means of the nadis, the Vidvan by means of the nadi called Sushumna, the Avidvan by means of some other nadi. Adhikarana 10. The departing soul passes up to the sun by means of a ray of light which exists at night as well as during day. Adhikarana 11. Also that Vidvan who dies during the Dakshinayana reaches Brahman. Pada 3. Adhikarana 1, 2, 3 reconcile the different accounts given in the Upanishads as to the stations of the way which leads the Vidvan up to Brahman. Adhikarana 4. By the stations we have, however, to understand not only the subdivisions of the way, but also the divine beings which lead the soul on. The remaining part of the pada is by Shankara divided into two adhikaranas. Of these, the former one teaches that the Brahman to which the departed soul is led by the guardians of the path of the gods is not the highest Brahman, but the affected, karya, or qualified, saguna, Brahman. This is the opinion propounded in Sutras 7 through 11 by Badari, and finally accepted by Shankara in his commentary on Sutra 14. In Sutras 12 through 14, Jaimini defends the opposite view, according to which the soul of the Vidvan goes to the highest Brahman, not to the Karyam Brahma. But Jaimini's view, although set forth in the latter part of the Adhikarana, is, according to Shankara, a mere Purva Paksha, while Badari's opinion represents the Vedantha. The latter of the two Adhikaranas, 6 of the whole pada, records the opinion of Badarayana on a collateral question, namely whether or not all those who worship the affected Brahman are led to it. The decision is that those only are guided to Brahman who have not worshipped it under a pratika form. According to Ramanuja, Sutras 7 through 16 form one Adhikarana only, in which the views of Badari and of Jaimini represent two Purvapakshas, while Badarayana's opinion is adopted as the Siddhanta. The question is whether the guardians of the path lead to Brahman only those who worship the affected Brahman, that is, Hiranyagarbha, or those who worship the highest Brahman, or those who worship the individual soul as free from Prakriti and having Brahman for itself. Ye pratyagatmanam prakriti viyuktam brahmatmakam upasate. The first view is maintained by Badari in Sutra 7, quote, the guardians lead to Brahman those who worship the affected Brahman, because going is possible towards the latter only, for no movement can take place towards the highest and as such omnipresent Brahman. The explanation of Sutra 9 is similar to that of Shankara, but more clearly replies to the objection that if Hiranyagarbha were meant in the passage, Purusho sa manava sa etan brahma gamayati, the text would read, sa etan brahmanam gamayati, that Hiranyagarbha is called Brahman on account of his nearness to Brahman, that is, on account of his pratamajatva. The explanation of 10:11 is essentially the same as in Shankara, so also of 12 through 14. The Vedantha view is established in Sutra 13. It is the opinion of Badarayana that it, that is, the Gana of the guardians, leads to Brahman those who do not take their stand on what is pratika, that is, those who worship the highest Brahman, and those who meditate on the individual self as dissociated from Prakriti and having Brahman for itself, but not those who worship Brahman under pratikas. For both views, that of Jaimini as well as that of Badari, are faulty. The Karya view contradicts such passages as, Asmak charirat samuttaya param jyotir upasampadya, etc. The Para view, such passages as that in the Pankagni Vidya, which declares that Ya itam vida, that is, those who know the Pankagni Vidya, are also led up to Brahman. Para 4. Adhikarana 1 returns, according to Shankara, to the owner of the Para Vidya, and teaches that when on his death his soul obtains final release, it does not acquire any new characteristics, but merely manifests itself in its true nature. The explanation given by Ramanuja is essentially the same, but of course refers to that Vidvan whose going to Brahman had been described in the preceding Pada. Adhikarana 2 determines that the relation in which the released soul stands to Brahman is that of avibhaga, non-separation. This, on Shankara's view, means absolute non-separation, identity. According to Ramanuja, the question to be considered is whether the released soul views itself as separate, pritagbhuta, from Brahman, or as non-separate because being a mode of Brahman. The former view is favored by those Shruti and Smriti passages which speak of the soul as being with or equal to Brahman, the latter by such passages as Tat Tvam Asi and the like. Adhikarana 3 discusses the characteristics of the released soul, that is, of the truly released soul according to Shankara. According to Jaimini, the released soul, when manifesting itself in its true nature, possesses all those qualities which in Chandogya Upanishad 8:7:1 and other places are ascribed to Brahman, such as apahata papmatva, satya samkalpatva, etc., Aishvarya. According to Audalomi, the only characteristic of the released soul is Caitanya. According to Badarayana, the two views can be combined, Shankara remarking that satya samkalpatva, etc., are ascribed to the released soul vyavahara pekshaya. Adhikarana 4 returns, according to Shankara, to the Apara Vidya and discusses the question whether the soul of the pious affects its desires by its mere determination or uses some other means. The former alternative is accepted. According to Ramanuja, the Adhikarana simply continues the consideration of the state of the released, begun in the preceding Adhikarana. Of the released soul, it is said in Chandogya Upanishad 8:12:3 that after it has manifested itself in its true nature, it moves about playing and rejoicing with women, carriages, and so on. The question then arises whether it affects all this by its mere samkalpa, it having been shown in the preceding Adhikarana that the released soul is, like the Lord, satya samkalpa, or not. The answer is in favor of the former alternative on account of the explicit declaration made in Chandogya Upanishad 8:2, by his mere will the fathers come to receive him. Adhikarana 5 decides that the released are embodied or disembodied according to their wish and will. Adhikarana 6 explains how the soul of the released can animate several bodies at the same time. Sutra 12 gives, according to Shankara, the additional explanation that those passages which declare the absence of all specific cognition on the part of the released soul do not refer to the partly released soul of the devotee, but either to the soul in the state of deep sleep, svapyaya equals shushupti, or to the fully released soul of the sage, sampati equals kaivalya. Ramanuja explains that the passages speaking of absence of consciousness refer either to the state of deep sleep or to the time of dying. Sampati equals matanam, according to, quote, van manasi sampadyate, etc. Adhikarana 7. The released jivas participate in all the perfections and powers of the Lord, with the exception of the power of creating and sustaining the world. They do not return to new forms of embodied existence. After having, in this way, rendered ourselves acquainted with the contents of the Brahma Sutras according to the views of Shankara as well as Ramanuja, we have now to consider the question which of the two modes of interpretation represents, or at any rate more closely approximates to the true meaning of the sutras. That few of the sutras are intelligible if taken by themselves, we have already remarked above, but this does not exclude the possibility of our deciding with a fair degree of certainty which of the two interpretations proposed agrees better with the text, at least in a certain number of cases. We have to note in the first place that, in spite of very numerous discrepancies, of which only the more important ones have been singled out in the conspectus of contents, the two commentators are at one as to the general drift of the sutras and the arrangement of topics. As a rule, the Adhikaranas discuss one or several Vedic passages bearing upon a certain point of the system, and in the vast majority of cases, the two commentators agree as to which are the special texts referred to. And, moreover, in a very large number of cases, the agreement extends to the interpretation to be put on those passages and on the sutras. This far-reaching agreement certainly tends to inspire us with a certain confidence as to the existence of an old tradition concerning the meaning of the sutras, on which the bulk of the interpretations of Shankara as well as of Ramanuja are based. But at the same time we have seen that, in a not inconsiderable number of cases, the interpretations of Shankara and Ramanuja diverge more or less widely, and that the sutras affected thereby are, most of them, especially important because bearing on fundamental points of the Vedanta system. The question then remains which of the two interpretations is entitled to preference. Regarding a small number of sutras, I have already, in the conspectus of contents, given it as my opinion that Ramanuja's explanation appears to be more worthy of consideration. We meet, in the first place, with a number of cases in which the two commentators agree as to the literal meaning of a sutra, but where Shankara sees himself reduced to the necessity of supplementing his interpretation by certain additions and reservations of his own, for which the text gives no occasion, while Ramanuja is able to take the sutra as it stands. To exemplify this remark, I again direct attention to all those sutras which in clear terms represent the individual soul as something different from the highest soul, and concerning which Shankara is each time obliged to have recourse to the plea of the sutra referring, not to what is true in the strict sense of the word, but only to what is conventionally looked upon as true. It is, I admit, not altogether impossible that Shankara's interpretation should represent the real meaning of the sutras, that the latter, indeed, to use the terms employed by Dr. Deussen, should for the nonce set forth an exoteric doctrine adapted to the common notions of mankind, which, however, can be rightly understood by him only to whose mind the esoteric doctrine is all the while present. This is not impossible, I say, but it is a point which requires convincing proofs before it can be allowed. We have had, in the second place, to note a certain number of Adhikaranas and sutras concerning whose interpretation Shankara and Ramanuja disagree altogether, and we have seen that not unfrequently the explanations given by the latter commentator appear to be preferable because falling in more easily with the words of the text. The most striking instance of this is afforded by the 13th Adhikarana of 2-3, which treats of the size of the jiva, and where Ramanuja's explanation seems to be decidedly superior to Shankara's, both if we look to the arrangement of the whole Adhikarana and to the wording of the single sutras. The Adhikarana is, moreover, a specially important one, because the nature of the view held as to the size of the individual soul goes far to settle the question what kind of Vedanta is embodied in Badarayana's work. But it will be requisite not only to dwell on the interpretations of a few detached sutras, but to make the attempt at least of forming some opinion as to the relation of the Vedanta Sutras as a whole to the chief distinguishing doctrines of Shankara as well as Ramanuja. Such an attempt may possibly lead to very slender positive results, but in the present state of the enquiry even a merely negative result, namely the conclusion that the sutras do not teach particular doctrines found in them by certain commentators, will not be without its value. The first question we wish to consider in some detail is whether the sutras in any way favor Shankara's doctrine that we have to distinguish a twofold knowledge of Brahman, a higher knowledge which leads to the immediate absorption, on death, of the individual soul in Brahman, and a lower knowledge which raises its owner merely to an exalted form of individual existence. The adhyaya first to be considered in this connection is the fourth one. According to Shankara, the three latter padas of that adhyaya are chiefly engaged in describing the fate of him who dies in the possession of the lower knowledge, while two sections tell us what happens to him who, before his death, had risen to the knowledge of the highest Brahman. According to Ramanuja, on the other hand, the three padas, referring throughout to one subject only, give an uninterrupted account of the successive steps by which the soul of him who knows the Lord through the Upanishads passes, at the time of death, out of the gross body which it had tenanted, ascends to the world of Brahman, and lives there forever without returning into the samsara. On an a priori view of the matter, it certainly appears somewhat strange that the concluding section of the sutras should be almost entirely taken up with describing the fate of him who has after all acquired an altogether inferior knowledge only, and has remained shut out from the true sanctuary of Vedantic knowledge, while the fate of the fully initiated is disposed of in a few occasional sutras. It is, I think, not too much to say that no unbiased student of the sutras would, before having allowed himself to be influenced by Shankara's interpretations, imagine for a moment that the solemn words, quote, "From thence is no return, from thence is no return," end quote, with which the sutras conclude, are meant to describe not the lasting condition of him who has reached final release, the highest aim of man, but merely a stage on the way of that soul which is engaged in the slow progress of gradual release, a stage which is indeed greatly superior to any earthly form of existence, but yet itself belongs to the essentially fictitious samsara, and as such remains infinitely below the bliss of true mukti. And this a priori impression, which, although no doubt significant, could hardly be appealed to as decisive, is confirmed by a detailed consideration of the two sets of sutras which Shankara connects with the knowledge of the higher Brahman. How these sutras are interpreted by Shankara and Ramanuja has been stated above in the conspectus of contents. The points which render the interpretation given by Ramanuja more probable are as follows. With regard to 4, 2, 12 through 14, we have to note in the first place the circumstance, relevant although not decisive in itself, that Sutra 12 does not contain any indication of a new topic being introduced. In the second place, it can hardly be doubted that the text of Sutra 13, quote, "Spashto hai ekesham," end quote, is more appropriately understood with Ramanuja as furnishing a reason for the opinion advanced in the preceding sutra than, with Shankara, as embodying the refutation of a previous statement, in which latter case we should expect not he, but tu. And in the third place, the eke, that is, some, referred to in Sutra 13 would, on Shankara's interpretation, denote the very same persons to whom the preceding sutra had referred, namely, the followers of the Kanvasaka, the two Vedic passages referred to in 12 and 13 being Brihadaranyaka Upanishad 4:4-5 and 3:2-11, according to the Kanva recension. While it is the standing practice of the sutras to introduce, by means of the designation eke, members of Vedic sakas, teachers, etc., other than those alluded to in the preceding sutras. With this practice, Ramanuja's interpretation, on the other hand, fully agrees, for, according to him, the eke are the Madhyandinas, whose reading in Brihadaranyaka Upanishad 4:4-5, namely Tasmat, clearly indicates that the Tasya in the corresponding passage of the Kanvas denotes the Sarira, that is, the Jiva. I think it is not saying too much that Shankara's explanation, according to which the eke would denote the very same Kanvas to whom the preceding sutra had referred, so that the canvas would be distinguished from themselves, as it were, is altogether impossible. End of section 7.